computer because everything else he typed out on a typewriter. Now, there's a clip in there as well where he's typing with one hand, and he can type. He could exceed 60 words a minute in German with one hand, and you see him banging away doing it there. Well, I'm sitting in the office with him, and we're kind of talking about something and laughing about something, and I happen to look over towards his printer, and I see all of these sheets of paper like a big bad haircut busting out of this printer. And he says, "Oh, yeah, that." He says, I write the spiritual teaching for the play Aaron, and Quetzal, he always has to come to my office, and he beams himself down into the office. He picks up the papers. He beams himself back into the ship, and he flies back, to be with the people and to give them the material. And he says, that's very time-consuming for them. They don't like to have to keep coming here. So next week, Zafanat Paneach is coming to fix my computer so I can type it and send it to a separate server, which will take the information and send it to a separate disk that hovers above the Earth that will then beam it back to the people in their, star system. And I'm going, yeah, what am I supposed to do with this, And I'm going, I can never prove it, and I'm not going to talk about it. But the next year, 1 year later in May, because there's a meeting that, everybody that's kind of interested goes to in May, and I get to sit down with Billy again, and we're talking, and again, I said, oh, wait a minute. So let me see how good his memory is or if he's going to tap dance with this. I said, say, Billy, did Zafanat Paneach ever show up? Oh, yeah. He says, I write the spiritual teachings for the play Aaron, and Quetzal, he always had to come into the office, get beamed down to pick up the papers, to go beam up into a ship and to go back home with the papers. But then Zafanat Paneach came, and he fixed it, so now I just have to write it and send it to a separate server, which is then picked up by a disk hovering above the Earth. Virtually the same story. And I'm going, holy cow. And then he goes, but there's a problem. I said, what's that? He says, he screwed something up on the computer, and he's got to come back next week and fix it. So now I've got 2 times, you're apart, that I'm talking to a guy who tells me he's got an IT from outer space. So the third year was last year, or I think the year before. I'm losing track. And for a third time, I asked Meier, so how's your computer? Did Zafanat say, oh, yeah, he fixed it. Now I just type in this code, and it goes, same story. And then when we were filming in September of last year, I asked him for the 4th time, pops it right out at me. Now, what's impressive to me is not just the weird and unprovable nature of this story, but when people tell the truth, they don't have to remember anything. It's just right there. It's real for you. I'm sure if I asked you a question about some point in your life, you'd have the details, and even if I asked you 4 or 5 times in the next several years, you would tell the same story because that's the truth. When you're lying and you have to remember, what did I say last time? It's a year later. I've only had 12,000 conversations. What did I tell this guy last time? So I was impressed by it because it was just as straight ahead as Meier is about everything else in terms of my experience with him.
Let's get into the photos.
Yeah.
What have you done? What steps have you taken beyond what Wendell Stevens and the elders did to verify, to document the legitimacy of the photos?
Well, first of all, the most honest answer in a sense is nothing, but there is something. What I've done, I could not, because I don't have the long sought-after negatives or slide positives, as the case was many, many times. I don't have them in my possession. I cannot take them for testing. So I researched everything I could about the analysis, the testing that was done, the pros and the cons about it. I would say that it was about, for all the people that saw that had any professional opinion and evaluation, it was 85% positive, maybe even more. There was I think it was Robert Post from JPL who had a positive and a negative. There are people that, for whom this couldn't be also in the scientific circles, but I did one thing myself. I brought the photos and the films to a company called Uncharted Territory, and they are the folks that won the Academy Award for Special Effects for Independence Day. And I was brought in by a guy who knew them, and we chatted for a while, and I said, would you folks look at some photos and some films? I've got a video of the film clips. And they said, well, sure. A couple of really, really nice guys is Mark Engel, Mark Weigart and Volker Engel, I think are their names. So we were there for about an hour, and I showed them the photo book, and they were pretty enthralled with the photos. I could tell that. But then we put on the film clips. And there's one clip, and we have it, of course, in the film. It's been seen quite a bit, where Meier has the ship coming in towards him, and a couple lights go on and off on the flanging and the cupola of the ship. I think you know that clip
yes.
as well.
Yes.
I mean, of course, there's another remarkable clip where the UFO is hovering over his head in the distance, but I decided to focus on a couple clearer ones. I showed them that one, and I said to them, I need to ask you something, guys, because the skeptics said that this is a model, and I barely got the word out, and they started laughing. I said, what's funny about that? And they said, well, we know models. That's not a model. I said, well, the skeptics said it's a model, and that Meier scratched the negative with a pin, and they said, look, pin scratching, we know that too. That's all old stuff. But first of all, they said, that's not a model. When was the film made? I said, it's made in somewhere around 77, 78. They said, no models. I said, special effects? They said, no. I said, well, could you duplicate this? And they said, well, if we could duplicate it, we'd have to go to CGI. All right. Now, that was my own personal connection. There's one other element, and it will probably come up in our conversation. I'll save it with another person. But here's what I did. I had all the skeptics, of course, attacking this, and the skeptics that we have in our film belongs to an organization called IIG and CFI West. CFI West in 2001 was the top professional skeptics organization, probably still is, and I brought them the photos and the films just as I recently did a couple of years ago to uncharted territory. I showed them to a case investigator. His name at the Vaughn Reese. He was a case investigator at CFI West, and he pronounced the following: this is an easily duplicated hoax. I challenged him at that time. Well, you think you can duplicate one of these photos and one of these films? No problem. Well, it was a problem because, for whatever reason, and they said that, well, there were other priorities. It took 3 years for them to produce 6 photos of a little model UFO in kind of ambiguous settings where it was cute, but it wasn't very impressive. And, strangely enough, I was on Art's show, I think it was 2004 or so, and I was talking, and this guy called in to protest being treated unfairly, and Art asked him a few questions, and I brought up the obvious one. I said, well, why doesn't Mr. Reese and CFI West have their photos tested to the same parameters that we know Meier's were tested by? And it's all documented in books and everything else. And the guy said, well, I'm not going to do that. And so Art said, well, goodbye. So we had that kind of a, experience, and then more recently, a couple of the skeptics, and perhaps we'll be getting into this maybe in the next hour, claimed that they too could duplicate it and that these were hoaxes and double exposures. So I have an article, actually 2 of them on my website. There's one on the front page called Look Out for That Tree. And it kind of details the challenge. And I basically say that the skeptical challenge to the authenticity of the Meier photos is absolutely over. Now, there are people that may want to beat a dead horse. But up until the time that someone using the same equipment that Meier was known to have used can come forward and produce the same quality, same detail, same light values and edge enhancement stuff, and believe me, I'm no expert on photographs, but they can put them to the test. Until they can do that, I think we've kind of put that to rest. Now, that's my opinion, but that's why I have an article or 2 up on my website, and that's why we put stuff in the film, so people can make up their own minds. I will tell you this much, and it's in the article. A skeptic named Jeff Ritzman, who is a model maker, a photographer, and quite a skeptic, claimed that he could duplicate Meier's UFO photos and film and video, by the way. And he produced some nice little photos. Actually, they were very good model photos. But there was something funny, and that was that after he had produced these photos, which were clearly not genuine when you looked at the clarity of the small object and, when you've got perspective and things like that. Everybody that I had showed them to, I showed them a bunch of photographers, and they said, well, that's a small object close to the, camera. I said, I know. Then Jeff accidentally revealed that he was a miniature tree cultivator. And Meier has a number of very famous photos with the UFO hovering around different angles around a tree. So I said, well, Jeff, since you haven't done, in my opinion, very well with this, why don't you give us one photo with your nice little model next to a model tree and settle this thing? You claim that those are all hoaxed with models and all this. He disappeared.
He's not entirely disappeared.
I know.
I've been
I'm sure
in contact
he's waiting
with
in
him.
the wing.
I'm not going to bring him on, but I certainly have been in contact with him about some questions he'd like to address to you,
Absolutely.
And we'll get into that when we come back. I'm